In the ancient Mediterranean, people found a metal that seemed made for them. Lead sat in the ground in ores that broke apart easily. It melted at a low heat, far lower than tougher metals, so small furnaces handled it. Once liquid, it poured and cooled into almost any shape. For early miners and metalworkers, that simplicity mattered. It turned raw rock into usable material with less fuel, less time, and less skill. That convenience pushed lead out of the mine and into daily routines. It became weights, seals, fittings, and sheets that patched and covered. It bent without cracking, so it solved problems that wood and stone could not. Builders used it where water leaked and joints failed. Craftsmen preferred it when precision mattered because it filled molds cleanly. And because it looked dull and calm, it rarely raised suspicion. A practical metal began to feel ordinary. But ordinary also meant constant contact. Lead dust rose when it was cut or filed. Fumes formed when it was heated again and again. Small amounts entered mouths from hands, cups, and stored liquids, and no one connected the metal to slow sickness. When harm appeared, it looked like bad luck, age, or fatigue. Lead kept spreading because it worked. Its hidden cost stayed invisible, and that misunderstanding became the starting point of a long history. Rome grew, and its engineering reached farther than its armies. Cities needed water that arrived predictably, not by luck or season. Lead helped solve that. It bent easily, it joined cleanly, and it held its shape. So pipes spread under streets and through walls, carrying water into baths, fountains, and homes. Convenience became a system, and that system quietly depended on a metal that did not stay put. Water moved through those lines day after day, and small amounts of lead entered it along the way. That exposure did not come from one dramatic mistake. It came from routine. Lead also appeared in vessels and storage, in fittings and linings, wherever builders wanted something durable and simple to work with. The more comfortable city life became, the more often people touched, drank, and ate from lead-linked surfaces. Then lead reached the table in another form. A sweet syrup made by boiling grape juice in lead vessels became a popular way to improve taste and preserve wine. It sounded harmless, even clever. It made food and drink smoother, more consistent, more enjoyable, but it also added another steady source of contamination. This was not exposure for a few workers in one place. It spread across a population, tied to everyday ease. In the early modern era, lead did not disappear. It simply changed jobs. As plumbing and building methods evolved, the metal found a new kind of power: appearance. Lead-based powders and washes gave faces a pale, uniform look that signaled wealth and refinement. The whiter the skin, the higher the status. The result seemed immediate and controllable, and that made it hard to resist. Lead also entered kitchens and marketplaces through craft. Potters used lead glazes because they flowed smoothly, fused at lower heat, and made surfaces look bright and glassy. Food and drink met those glazes every day. At the same time, painters handled lead pigments that covered well and dried the way artists wanted. These were practical advantages, not accidents. But convenience came with exposure again and again. Then the warnings became harder to ignore. Some people who used these products suffered strange, stubborn illness, stomach pain, weakness, trembling, and a slow decline that did not fit ordinary disease. Among painters, a pattern stood out. Doctors and workers began calling it painter's colic, because the cramps and sickness kept returning in the same trade. Lead still looked like a tool for beauty and quality. It also behaved like a hidden poison. In the Industrial Revolution, lead stopped being a material you met only in a workshop or a vanity case. It became a mass commodity. Mines expanded, ore moved faster, and smelters ran harder to feed a growing economy. Lead went into pipes and paint, but also into new products that depended on modern manufacturing. The more industries scaled up, the more people handled lead every day. Progress carried a hidden cost. The exposure changed shape. It was no longer occasional contact. It was constant breathing and swallowing. Dust rose when ore was crushed. Fumes formed when metal was heated. Particles settled on skin, food, and work clothes, then travelled home. Workers developed familiar patterns of illness, stomach pain, weakness, tremors, confusion, and paralysis. In many jobs, these symptoms appeared so often they started to look like part of the trade. That normality was the danger. This was when factory medicine began separating bad luck from a workplace cause. Doctors attached to mines and large plants recorded cases, compared job tasks, and noticed that certain rooms and processes produced predictable sickness. Lead poisoning emerged as an occupational disease, something created by the way modern work was organized. The records did not stop the metal from being used, but they changed the argument. Lead was no longer just mysterious illness, it had an address. By the late 1800s, paint stopped being a small craft and became a mass product. Builders wanted surfaces that looked clean, stayed bright, and survived weather and scrubbing. Lead-based paint did all of that. It spread fast, not as a luxury, but as a standard choice for homes, schools, hospitals, and offices. Once it went on, it tended to stay. Layer after layer turned buildings into long-term storage for poison. The danger hid in how paint aged. Lead paint did not just fade. It broke down into flakes and fine dust. Every repair, every scrape, every door that rubbed a frame created more. That dust moved easily through a building and settled where hands went. It clung to floors, windowsills, and toys. Adults mostly absorbed it slowly. Children, closer to the ground and quicker to mouth objects, took it in faster. This was the trap of lead paint. It kept working even when no one painted again. A fresh coat could seal older layers for a time, then the cycle returned as the surface wore. In crowded housing and busy public buildings, disturbance happened constantly. The exposure did not require a factory or a mine. It happened at home. It happened in classrooms. A routine building material turned childhood itself into the risk. By the 1920s, cars multiplied and engines faced a stubborn problem. Knock. Fuel ignited unevenly, power dropped, parts wore out, and drivers complained. Engineers chased a simple fix, and one additive seemed to deliver it fast. It was tetraethyl lead, a lead-based chemical mixed into gasoline in tiny amounts. The result sounded like progress. The knock faded, engines ran smoother, and a new market opened overnight. But this was not lead locked inside a pipe or sealed under paint. This lead rode inside fuel, and fuel was meant to be burned. Every start, every mile, every trip through a city street ended the same way. Exhaust. The additive did its job in the engine, then left the tailpipe as fine particles and fumes. Lead stopped being a problem, limited to mines and factories. It became something cars spread everywhere. Once lead entered gasoline, the scale changed. Millions of vehicles released it in places people lived, worked, and raised children, along roads, near schools, across neighborhoods, and far beyond cities. Wind carried it, rain brought it down, and dust held it. The poison did not need a workplace accident or a peeling wall. Ordinary driving was enough. A modern convenience turned into a worldwide source of airborne contamination. By the mid-20th century, the question shifted. It was no longer only about obvious poisoning and hospital cases. Scientists started looking at smaller, everyday exposures. Dust on hands, fumes in city air, flakes from old paint. When they followed children over time, the pattern did not fade. Tiny amounts still changed how kids learned, behaved, and developed. The old assumption of a harmless threshold started to wobble. Researchers then reached for measurements that felt undeniable. Blood lead. Instead of guessing what a child touched or breathed, they tested what entered the body. The results shocked health officials. Many children carried lead levels that were common, not rare, and those levels lined up with real harm: lower attention, delayed development, weaker school performance. It meant damage appeared long before anyone saw classic symptoms. Quiet exposure still injured brains. That data forced a new kind of reckoning. If so many children showed measurable lead, and if harm appeared at doses once called acceptable, then safe started to sound like a myth. Each time standards were set, new studies pushed the danger line lower. The gap between policy and biology widened. Lead was not just an industrial hazard anymore. It looked like a widespread developmental threat hiding in plain sight. By the 1970s, the evidence no longer sat in journals alone. It showed up in blood tests, in school records, in city health reports, and it forced a new kind of response, not advice, but rules. Governments began targeting the biggest everyday source first: leaded gasoline. The logic was simple. If lead rode in the air from every tailpipe, then everyone breathed it, whether they chose to or not. So regulators tightened fuel standards year after year, pushing oil companies to reformulate and car makers to adapt. The change moved gradually, but it reached everywhere roads reached. At the same time, lead paint faced new limits. Not because the paint looked dangerous, but because it aged into dust and chips, and that dust ended up on hands, toys, and floors. Exposure came from normal living. The turning point came in the numbers. As lead disappeared from gasoline and new lead paint stopped entering the market, average blood lead levels fell across whole countries. It did not mean the problem vanished. Old paint still sat on old walls and old fuel emissions still lingered in soil, but the direction changed. For the first time in centuries, policy drove exposure down instead of letting it spread. In the 2000s, many people believed the lead problem had ended. Average levels had dropped, headlines had moved on, and regulations had existed on paper, but the old system still ran underneath daily life. Water did not simply arrive clean. It travelled through aging pipes and fittings that still contained lead. When treatment changed or corrosion control failed, that lead dissolved and moved straight into kitchen taps. The danger returned quietly, house by house. In the 2010s, water crises exposed how uneven enforcement turned a known hazard into a fresh disaster. Residents reported strange smells, rashes, and brown water, and officials delayed action while exposure continued. Children absorbed the damage first, and blood tests became the proof no one could ignore. At the same time, lead slipped in through other doors. Imported toys, spices, cosmetics, and remedies sometimes carried contaminated pigments or powders, bypassing weak screening. Another pathway grew in plain sight: informal recycling. Used car batteries and electronic waste got broken apart in yards, alleys, and small workshops where protections did not exist. Lead dust settled on floors, clothing, and soil, then followed families back indoors. The pattern repeated across neighborhoods and across borders. The lesson of the era felt blunt. Lead poisoning did not need new inventions. It only needed old material, poor oversight, and people left with no safe choices. By today, lead got surrounded by rules. Many countries banned it from gasoline, limited it in paint, and set strict workplace standards. Parents learned to fear peeling chips and invisible dust. Testing became common, labels appeared, and for many people, the danger felt handled. But lead never needed to be used on purpose to keep harming. It only needed to be left behind in places built long ago. Old housing kept the problem alive. When paint aged, it turned into fine dust that settled where children crawled, played, and touched their mouths. Renovations stirred it up again, sometimes making a home more dangerous after an upgrade. Aging pipes and fittings added another route. Water that seemed clean at the tap still picked up lead on the way, especially when corrosion control failed or maintenance lagged. Beyond wealthy cities, the risks spread differently, but hit just as hard. Industrial hotspots released lead into air and soil through smelting, mining waste, and battery production. Informal recycling exposed workers and nearby families without protections that regulations assumed. The metal travelled in goods and scrap, crossing borders faster than inspections. Awareness rose, yet exposure still followed old patterns. It gathered where systems weakened, and it punished the least protected.